Welcome to the Pen Leader Podcast, where strategic leaders get straight to the topics, strengthening our awareness and sharpening our minds. The Pen Leader Podcast is produced by Roar, a production division of Mays & Associates Ltd. Find out more at www.maysassociatesltd.com. Now here is your award-winning host, Dr. Shanda Gore.
And welcome back to the Pen Leader Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about managing crisis. And I have with me someone who's been working on crisis management and strategy for more than 2 decades, Miss Becky Carroll. And she is the president and founder of Strategist, which is a strategic communications firm. She and her team of staff and advisors provide a range of strategy and communication services to help clients meet their goals, including strategic planning, crisis communications, event management, community engagement, campaign management, and she's earned that media management and relations spokesperson spot. She's quite amazing. She's been a valued advisor to both private and public sector executives, from City Hall and the Illinois Office of the Governor to Fortune 500 companies and some of Chicago's most prominent nonprofits and businesses. She recently, for Strategist, was included in the Inc. Magazine 2024 Best in Business Award, 3 2024 Publicity Club of Chicago Golden Trumpet Awards for Best Advocacy, Media Relations, and Community Engagement Campaigns. And she's also the 2024 Stevie American Business Award for Best PR and Communications Firm, and so many others. And she's also a graduate of Loyola University of Chicago, Public Relations and Political Science. So for those that are listening that may be graduates of there, you might know her. Without further ado, welcome, Becky.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
It's wonderful. I'm so glad you could join me. So there's a couple of key components here, and I'm seeing this as we talk about management of crisis, and especially not only in the media, but in social media, and sometimes even within those that own their own firms and own their own companies, and they're trying to figure out what is even considered a crisis, how to react to it. And I did notice that there were some statistics out there. There's a number of those that are not prepared for crisis. I saw some statistics from Forbes from a Capterra survey that said 49% of U.S. companies have a formal crisis communication plan, but that nearly 23% have no plan and 28% have an informal plan, which I was quite surprised by that. So I'm going to get right into that. What do you see, and what's your experience look like in that area?
Sure. Well, I'm not surprised to hear that, and that's in part why I am kept very busy in the crisis communication space. And, when I work with clients through a crisis, and a crisis is usually often something that they haven't seen coming or they've recently seen coming, and recognize that quickly they need some help because they don't have a plan in place or they don't have the skill set internally to manage through building a crisis communication plan to ready themselves for what's coming. After we go through the machinations of managing that crisis, I am the first to urge them to put the infrastructure in place to ensure they never find themselves in that situation again. One, it could be detrimental to your business, but also it can throw you and your team off of focusing on your business for days or weeks, depending on the nature of the crisis. So that's why it's really important to have a crisis communication plan in place, to know what your A, B, C, and D is going to do in the event of that crisis, so that you can manage that while at the same time still being able to do, your day-to-day job, so to speak, and meet your responsibilities. Crisis today comes, I feel like, in so many forms, especially with social media being so pervasive. And I also think in the workplace today, there's very different dynamics between folks who are on payroll and, leadership, that there is a lot of crisis that emerges out of the workplace. And so there could be external crisis coming in that you have to manage. And then there's crisis that is created internally that you also might have to manage. And I don't think there's a single business nonprofit or other entity these days that doesn't have to be prepared for it. And if you're not, you're going to be caught flat-footed, but worse, it could end up, in the worst cases, sinking your business.
I was going to say, you've probably seen a combination of a number of that where you probably have actually probably read where you see a company going down a pathway and you say, no, don't do that. And there's really no way to stop the sinking of the ship because they didn't know, and it's apparent they don't have a plan.
Yeah. I've seen that happen, and there have been times where I've seen that happen, and we ended up jumping in to help kind of manage through that crisis. There was one crisis client we had in the hospital industry, and it's front page news. It was in the midst of COVID. They were accused of misusing COVID vaccinations. And this was at a time when there was in very short supply, people were dying, and they were assigned to help distribute it to a very specific set of individuals who were in desperate need. They had enlisted what I would say is their PR firm that was more about managing their day-to-day and didn't have any crisis experience. Another skill set. Not all PR firms are necessarily ready to manage crisis as well. And in their case, they found that out very quickly, but 3 weeks too late. And it probably took another 3 months to extricate themselves from headlines and stories. And because so much misinformation got out, and it took so long for them to do the hard work required to hop on the phone with every single reporter, every single editorial board, every producer, every editor, to walk through the facts so that they understood what the realities were around that situation, as opposed to just letting this fester and to create more misinformation about the situation. That's what they did. So, when we came in, we tried to level set. We were like, okay, we need the facts. We need the data. We need to know who our subject matter experts are. And we need to very quickly turn around a plan to start mitigating the stories that were coming online, while at the same time educating reporters, but as well as stakeholders, local elected officials, staff, partners, clients, to make sure they knew the facts as well. So the moral of that story is, one, have a crisis plan in place so you have that crisis tree ready to put in motion. And if you don't, hire a firm that has expertise in managing crisis, because that will end up not just saving you headaches, but frankly, saving you money and helping you to more quickly get back into focusing on the work that you do.
Now, you have just outlined a procedure of how to go about it, especially if you don't know what to do, and seeking out help from those with expertise. And I would love to add to that is, do your background. Don't just go by word of mouth that this group has that expertise. There's a lot of that. With there's popularity, and then there's understanding if this group or individuals can really help you with a real track record. The other piece too, I think, when you're talking about organizations, so those are large groups, businesses that may be, like you mentioned, a hospital system that went through this. What about an individual within an organization? What's that look like from a crisis management? Maybe someone has done something. How do you mitigate that?
Right. I think it partly depends on where they are kind of in the structure of the organization. If we're talking a CEO, a CFO, a COO versus somebody who might be, answering the phones, it's a different approach. But when it is, say, the founder, when it is the leader of the organization, those are different approaches that you have to managing through that crisis. And it also depends on the nature of the crisis. Sometimes if it's a business and you have someone who is accused of doing something that has nothing to do with the business, there's only going to be so much that you can do internally to own that crisis. What you have to do instead is manage that crisis and make sure that you're protecting your business from whatever the fallout, whatever association you may have with that individual. And sometimes that just might mean immediately, depending of course on the nature of the issue, that individual is put on an immediate leave pending review of the situation to ensure that there's a full understanding of what that is. And you have to be public about that and swift about that. You have to, of course, also follow contractual and personnel rules that are associated with that. So that's not just going to require, say, your crisis communications person, internal or external, to manage that, but also lawyers, personnel, HR. So you have a crisis team in place that's going to have to be at the table to determine that. That's again why it's really important that you have a crisis communication plan in place, regardless for the situation, whether it is directly impacting, whether it's directly related to your business or your nonprofit, or it's related to someone that is on your board or in leadership or on staff, someone you might be a donor. You have to be ready for all of those scenarios, because you really have to shelter the brand of the organization to ensure that ultimately you don't get sucked into that. And then also you're swiftly and quickly, efficiently communicating to your stakeholders where you stand, so that you try to mitigate any kind of outcomes from that situation that can, again, distract your business or organization from the work that you're there to do every day.
And I think that's critically important to think about it, not only in that larger forum, but actually you're speaking to those that may have to mitigate a situation that's even in a smaller. You may have a handful of employees, but if one of those employees is doing something that actually puts you in unfortunate situation with a customer, or has done something that may not be appropriate within the company itself, it doesn't matter what size you are, you really do need to have a crisis management plan. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I will give you an example. There's a very well-known, very active, engaged nonprofit in the Chicagoland area that served a very high need population of people. And they were very unique also in serving this population, meaning there were not a lot of other organizations doing the work that they did, which meant, like, if they became compromised in some way and couldn't continue what they were doing, they would leave hundreds, if not even maybe thousands of clients in the lurch to seek their services. And it was discovered through an internal audit that a very high up member of their organization had been stealing money from the organization to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. And through that further investigation, discovered that there were others on the team involved as well. So before that had been exposed and made public, they were very smart. And they had a board chair that recognized that they needed to get ahead of it and have a plan before it became public knowledge. And that move, I think, literally ended up saving the organization, because they were able to come up with a plan with a crisis communications team like ours, in addition to engaging certain members of their board and other certain members of their leadership, including law enforcement, to be ready for when the switch flipped, when it was going to become public knowledge. So they were able to not just own the narrative, but to be able to communicate that they were on top of it, they addressed it, they're fixing it. So it was a great assurance to donors and stakeholders and clients that they were on top of it, and we were able to leverage that for them, so they could immediately raise money to be able to cover this enormous gap that they were suddenly facing. They were on the verge of not making payroll. That's how bad it was. So it not only helped really save their brand and public-facing image, but it literally helped save the organization. When you come across situations like that, it's very serious, and you have to recognize the severity of that kind of a situation and make sure that you are ready to communicate and have a plan in place to assure your stakeholders that you're on it, you're fixing it, you're addressing it, you're going to have controls in place so it never happens again. And you got to have that narrative ready and ready to communicate that, not just say to the public, to the media, but your stakeholders, your full board members, your staff, your donors, your government partners, other partners that, because a lot of these organizations also might have some kind of regulation associated with what they do. So you have to think through every level of stakeholders. It needs to be engaged, it needs to hear this message, and you have to figure out who that messenger is going to be, make sure they are prepped, have materials on paper, oftentimes emails, tweaked to different audiences, but still based on the same core narrative and messaging to ensure that, again, you are quickly and efficiently getting that message out so that no one else is filling that void and telling that narrative for you.
Right there, I think that last part too, on top of everything, that void, people who do not have information or organizations don't have information will fill their own gaps with their own information, either based on a rumor or, again, misinformation, but they're trying to figure out because people do not like holes. And I have witnessed in a number of circumstances, we do so much work, our firm does so much work with culture building. It's so important. If rumors start when you don't have a clear communications on what is occurring. And if you don't get ahead of it, people will make up a story and it take you down a different rabbit hole that you may not even realize would be created, and it's not even close to the truth surrounding an individual or circumstance, like you just mentioned. And it doesn't matter what size of an organization you are, but how it's delivered too, I think, is just important. Have you advised on who should deliver a message and how to go about it?
Yes, absolutely. If you have to deliver a message, say, to the public through the media, because you have media knocking on your door, or you're going to proactively engage the media to inform the public of a situation, it depends, again, on the nature of the situation. Sometimes my firm will serve as the spokesperson for delivering that message. Sometimes it'll be the board chair. Sometimes it will be the president. Those are usually individuals that will be tapped to be that messenger, but it always depends on the nature of the situation, and every situation is different. But sometimes it's very important for the leader of that organization to be on the record, communicating clearly to every stakeholder that they've got it, that they're on top of it, that they're managing it. But sometimes it's an occasion where it needs to be that external, that spokesperson like myself or someone on my team who's articulating what that message is, especially if it might come to, that president or board chair or someone else might in some way or shape or form be engaged with what that situation might be. Or at some point down the road, we might recognize, they are going to be subject to pending litigation, and we can't have them on the record. Sometimes we'll have the lawyer on the record. Again, it all depends on the situation, and each situation is unique. But again, that's why you need a plan. And so, because time matters, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're a large corporation or small, you can usually ascertain what are the top 5 types of crises we can find ourselves in. And you build a basic crisis plan to address each of those. So your spokesperson might be, you've already identified what channels you'll have to communicate to stakeholders around those crises, and then who you need to have at the table to give the sign off on what that plan's going to look like. Again, it's planning is really everything, anticipating and then mitigating whatever that crisis is.
Hopefully people are taking notes and they recognize that they may have to put a crisis plan together, even though they're saying, we're doing fine. It's not when you're doing fine. There's a strategic plan, you have goals, but there's always that time when you're going to have to pivot based on a circumstance that you did not have any control over.
Yeah, you're only doing fine until you're not doing fine. And no one's paying attention when you're doing fine. When you're not doing fine, you will soon discover that you had enemies that you had no idea that you had enemies around. And that's what happens with individuals, especially elected officials who we advise quite a bit as well when they find themselves in situations like this. And those are ones where, when you're like the face of you need to be prepared and have someone who is an expert who could jump in, drop everything they are doing to help you be prepared to mitigate for whatever that is, and think through, what's the first day going to look like? What's the second day going to look like? What's the third day going to look like? And what are you going to try to do to emerge from that crisis so that you're going to wake up on day 3 and 4 and no one is paying attention to that anymore, at least for now, right? The goal is to be able to move past that moment in time. And, kind of in today's environment, there's so many things you're competing with, eating up the oxygen and the attention of the media and social media, that they will move on eventually. There was a time when crises happened, say before really social media took hold, and, news media would hold on to those headlines for days and days, if not weeks. It's different today. It might depend too. I mean, if it's a major crisis with the mayor or a president, that might be different. But oftentimes they're moving on to whatever is the next news of the day. And you just have to be able to hold your hand of your client and help them get through that. And then have a plan to get through day 1, 2, 3, more, hopefully not than that. Until then, they can emerge from that and then figure out how do they make sure they're not in that situation again.
That's excellent advice. I'm going to ask you, because you do so much work, you have your own podcast. You have the broadcast.
Yeah.
And I'm so excited. You've been doing it for 8 years. I think before podcasting really kicked in and did a lot of work, you were groundbreaking in a lot of areas. But I'm going to have to ask you, what are you watching and what are you reading? Because you know so much and work in so many industries.
Yeah, sure. I am someone who, when I find something I really like I'm a huge Game of Thrones fan, right? I am now on my 3rd watch of that. And because it's one of these shows, and I'm attracted to shows that have ensemble characters that go really deep with every character, where there's multiple storylines. And I feel like every time I watch it, I learn something new. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't catch that last time. I feel like when I need to unwind, I work a lot of, for better or worse, 16-hour days. I need something to kind of turn my brain off. And I like going to something that I know is familiar. I'm always watching for shows that are women-centric. I'm a huge fan of kind of the suspense and spy and whatnot. I was a huge fan of Scandal with Kerry Washington. And so those are things that I often gravitate towards, like strong female characters, female-centric stories. And these, ensemble, multi-character, multi-story shows. And frankly, right now, I am not reading anything. I have to admit, between work and children, I'm not down to 2 or 3 books anymore. But I do have a huge stack that I'm waiting to get through.
I totally appreciate that. I get it.
Yes, I will say one thing that I have been reading through. It's called Everybody Needs an Editor, and it's co-written by a good friend of mine and a marketing guru and former journalist and a professor named Melissa Harris. And she decided to take all of her skills and experience in writing to put it all in a book to help people, whether they're professionals like me or novices, learn how to write everything from an email to a social post to a condolence letter, something much more substantive, a bio or a press release. And it's a really valuable tool. So everybody needs an editor. If you're an aspiring writer or just looking to up your skill set, I would get that book.
That is wonderful. I will definitely be checking that out. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and just sharing all that wisdom concerning crisis management and giving us more to think about than maybe we started off with. So I really appreciate your time.
Of course, happy to do so. Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. And thank you to our listeners who've been sharing the show. We appreciate you. Remember, any feedback that you have, please do not hesitate to send it to info@MaysAssociatesLTD.com, and remember to sign up and get on the wait list for the Pen Leader Path. And that book is due out March 2025. So, of course, until next time.
The Pen Leader Podcast is hosted by Dr. Shanda Gore and brought to you by Mays & Associates LTD, creating customized solutions for growth in the areas of leadership development, strategic planning, and culture building. Find out more at www.MaysAssociatesLTD.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the Pen Leader Podcast and share with others.